All right. Well, we will move on to Doan Vu Duc. I hope I didn't butcher your name too badly. Who's going to talk about the precautionary principle.
It's all right the way you pronounce my name. I hope you can all hear me well. Kelly? Yeah, okay, great. Well, so thank you. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm a PhD student working in Belgium on space ethics at the Catholic University of Louvain. So really close to Astrid Madeira, who talked a bit earlier. Well, it turns out in Belgium, they don't see the relevance of applied ethics and of space exploration. So it's kind of difficult to find a financement or a grant. So I'm still looking for it, but I'm already working on my thesis. And so I've just started this year, and I'm really glad to share my research with you. So I have slightly changed the title of my presentation. It's actually called A Utilitarian Study of the Mass Colonization. But I will talk about the precautionary principle a bit later. So just to start, there has been different projects of exploration or colonization in the last years. More and more private companies are involved in the space exploration. Astronomers are studying the habitability of Mars, for instance. And well, the colonization of the planet is still far, but it deserves even more attention. And other presenters have already talked about it today. We are currently before that colonization, and so there are different actors, and different actors are planning that colonization, and we're at the very beginning of the process. And this is why I propose an ethical study of that process of the mass colonization. And so I will present the main potential scenarios of development that might occur, and given the small amount of time. So just a quick reminder about utilitarianism. So first of all, in the ethics of mass colonization, I work on the assumption that the heart of the subject is not the human right, which is I would have tackled the subject in a deontological framework, for instance. But I think that utilitarianism is probably the most relevant approach at this stage of the process. And so most of you probably already know what utilitarianism is, but for a quick reminder, utilitarianism is a consequentialist moral theory, which means that an act has no intrinsic moral value, on the contrary of deontological ethics, for instance, and that only its consequences do. So the specificity of utilitarianism is this claim that an act is morally good, but only if its consequences maximize the welfare for the greatest number of people, basically. And so, in other words, the theory asks, given a certain situation, a certain context, what action would maximize the welfare for the most? And so long-term utilitarian considerations will be at the center of this talk. And just before I start talking about the scenarios, two points should be highlighted here. First of all, it's about the future generations, and then about the meaning of the welfare or the good. So first of all, it should be noted that we are in a traditional anthropocentric ethics, where humans are the only moral agents and only human welfare has a normative value. So this is an important point in the calculation of the welfare of the potential scenarios that will take place afterwards. And given that, I assume that we should care about future generations. And this is a topic that has very much discussed in philosophy. At least the very next future generations. As a goal of utilitarianism is to maximize the welfare for the maximum humans, I see hardly how we could avoid taking future generations into account in that calculation. And so now I'm talking about that calculation. There's the question of what we mean by the welfare or the good. If different notions have been discussed in the literature, For instance, one very known idea is that the quantity of welfare or good is measured by the quantity of pleasure, which is a hedonist point of view. But I choose to measure the welfare with the satisfaction of preferences. So you could see it as kind of a freedom, freedom to choose, freedom to have the maximum potential options and material to do things or not do things, but at least have that freedom. And the reason I choose that definition of the welfare is that this is an anticipation of the welfare or well-being of the future generations, and we lack too much information about them and about what will be their welfare, their notion, what they will need to do, what they will want to do, what will be good to them. So the welfare will be measured by the width of their range of action. Or here you can hear it as the potential actions available. And so here is the heart of my talk. What are the available options? What are the potential scenarios I'm talking about for now 6 minutes? Because now we have made all the details clear, or I hope so. And so we can discuss the subject. And I have identified 3 main scenarios, but there is a whole spectrum of scenarios between them, of course. And we could imagine or discuss variations of these 3. The first one would be what I call a free exploitation scenario. So it's one where the colonization of Mars is not or poorly legislated, leaving private companies free to exploit it. And so, for instance, companies like SpaceX or whatever set up on Mars, different villages are created, humans are sent, a political system is put in place, etc., etc. And in that scenario, it's actually very difficult to anticipate the consequences this would have on the future generation. That is, there must be a gain in the welfare for humans, as it will, for instance, somehow enable humans to have more options of action. But this gain is hard to evaluate right now and hence to calculate, as we have too few information about the future. And what is difficult with that scenario is that I see a few counter arguments, and we can discuss that later. I see actually 2 counter arguments. The first one is that there is something we know. It is that a free exploitation will limit options for future generations. I mean, it would force future generations in a certain path. For instance, they wouldn't have the possibility to leave Mars untouched or to exploit it another way, or to avoid the potential harmful consequences of that free colonization. And the second counter-argument is that given the unknown character of that natural environment, it can be argued that we risk damaging Mars too much, and so leave too few room for maneuver for future generations, as they might actually develop better technologies than us. I mean, more efficient or less destructive technologies. And so this is the kind of problem encountered in archaeology, that choice between exploiting a certain place in order to make more research and thinking about future generations who might have better technologies to leave that place as untouched as possible. And so these are the 2 counter arguments that I see against the free exploitation scenario. So I propose another one, the second one. It's called just the conservation scenario, because in the previous, so it's a lot difficult to defend the free exploitation as the best way of developing it. And so if we take the opposing view and study a scenario where Mars is fully protected, well, we can see that it makes a scenario where we would leave Mars untouched. I mean, as much untouched as possible. And this option would be a good way to preserve the future generations' choices. I mean, it would satisfy their preferences. They will be free to do what they want or need to do. They can either leave Mars as it is, or exploit it, or do whatever they need to do. And if the financial resources are used for other purposes right now, such as, I don't know, sustainable development, well, this scenario provides more welfare to humans, to the current and the future generations. And it provides more welfare than the first scenario I have proposed with the free exploitation. However, another counter argument I see against that scenario is that one could argue that we are omitting the potential welfare of scientific knowledge, and I've seen others already talking about it. So the potential welfare of scientific knowledge given by the expeditions on Mars. So whether knowledge is a measure of the welfare or not is another philosophical question that we won't tackle here. But at least we can argue for a little less restrictive legislation, which would allow for limited non-human scientific expeditions, since we can assume that these expeditions won't significantly reduce the potential actions for future generations. And so in that conservation scenario, well, the gain of welfare stems from the preservation of choices for future generations. But I want to talk about my last scenario, and it's almost the end, so it's all right. The last one I have called legislated colonization, because against the previous scenario, one could reply that a strict protection of Mars does not give future generations the widest range of action possible. That is, starting a colonization of Mars or a planet or even the moon takes a lot of preparation, and especially a long preparation. So it may take, I don't know, years or decades. The territory must be studied. For a small group of humans must be sent, material must be sent, vital resources, etc. So if eventually future generations are willing to exploit Mars because, for instance, they might need it, they will be unable to do so before a certain time. And in the case of an emergency or a very quick need, the lack of preparation could cause much more harm, more bad, than if the planet were already ready to be colonized. So I advocate for a legislated colonization of Mars, which allows enough to prepare future needs of humanity, but forbids sufficiently to protect the planet against our potentially harmful actions. And so the main difficulty of this option is to analyze the consequences of that scenario and to determine to what extent the legislation should allow or forbid actions. But here it is, and here is the research. However, there are two questions that we should ask. It is, first of all, what are the risks? And then, are there thresholds that shouldn't be exceeded? For instance, in terms of the number of human presences on Mars, and which actions are risky actually, and which aren't. And as these questions are difficult to answer to, well, the reason why these questions are really difficult to answer to is that we're facing unknown unknowns. And in this case, it is judicious to use the precautionary principle, because it's exactly in the specter of that principle. And I've seen that Eric Persson has already mentioned the PP, precautionary principle, in the discussion. But just to remind it, the PP basically says that in the absence of a scientific evidence of risks, we should not act. So in other words, the absence of scientific certitudes about the harm of a certain act is not an argument to act. And so if we follow the precautionary principle in that case, we should actually do the least action possible and avoid actions for which we are unable to anticipate the outcome, but for which we have a reasonable suspicion of risks. So a legislation that follows the precautionary principle could therefore determine certain places where humans could go and others that should be left as they are. Given that, for instance, I don't know, terrestrial bacteria could potentially cause harm, or whatever other acts could cause harm. And so this would avoid the problem of the free exploitation scenario, risky exploitation, potential harm, reducing the future actions for future generations, while allowing them to exploit or not Mars the way they want, considering the long process implied by a colonization. So starting the colonization of Mars as soon as possible is actually the scenario that leaves future generations with the widest range of options. And this is what I defend. And so this could in turn, this could turn out useful for them, for instance, because where humans need certain resources present on Mars. But so this is the point I wanted to defend here. Thank you.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time left for discussion, but Joe?
Yeah, so thanks for the talk. So I want to push a bit on how you define the good and the implications of that for one of the objections you made to the free exploitation scenario. So as I understand you, you define the good in terms of the satisfaction of preferences, and as a corollary of this, it involves the range of possible actions we can and cannot do. And I think this is especially germane to your objection to the free exploitation scenario, where you say that on that scenario, it would force humans down a certain path, one in which Mars is exploited, and they will not, and therefore, because of that, they will not have the possibility to leave Mars untouched. As you put it in your longer video, you say there's no turning back. But see, my concern is this. There are many possibilities that have been foreclosed for us due to the actions of people in the past that have no bearing on our realizing the good. So for instance, because of the actions of people in the past, I can no longer hunt dodo birds. Now, I don't really want to hunt dodo birds, but I can't do that. So that is a preference I can't have satisfied. But so what, right? Who cares? The actions of past people are not wrong in virtue of this fact, the fact, namely, that I can't hunt dodo birds. So the upshot of that, and I'm building to my main point here, the upshot of that is that this moral principle doesn't hold in general. Okay, so it doesn't. I think it's questionable to say it holds in general. Now, given that, we might wonder why it holds in the Mars conservation case. And for my part, and this is the upshot, I can't see why, unless you're assuming from the get-go that our inability to conserve in this context is a moral harm. But of course, if you're making that assumption, you're begging the question, right? So I guess I mean, there might be ways around this, but from my perspective, I don't exactly see, right? I don't, and this isn't, to be clear, this isn't a knock against utilitarianism. I actually have no problems with this as a first order normative ethical theory in general, but just combining this package of views, right? Like, I'd want to know more why there's a principled reason why that possibility being foreclosed is a harm without actually begging the question against this option, right? Which is, of course, something you don't want to do.
Well, I see your point. I don't quite have an answer right now, but I see your point. Yeah.
You can get back to me. I just think it's, it matters. Right?
Yeah, you're right. Right. Yeah. This is probably something I should dig a bit further. Yeah.
All right, Neil.
Hi, Doan. This is more just a suggestion than a question. You bring up the precautionary principle. There are so many versions of it. There are a lot of different ways of formulating it. You should try to be precise and consistent. It really can make a difference to how your argument goes, I think, which one you have in mind. And I didn't really pick that up. Maybe it's going to be in the written version of this, but I didn't pick it up in your presentation or in what you just, in your YouTube presentation or in what you just said.
Okay, thank you. Well, I must say the lack of time wasn't really with the lack of time, it wasn't really easy to define it. But yeah, probably. I mean, in my research, I would, extend the arguments and the definitions, and I just try to shorten as much as possible here. But yeah.
Okay, Carlos.
Hi, thank you for your talk. What I want to ask about is what you think the right way of discounting the preferences and or utilities of future people are. I know you think more in terms of their preferences. I mean, most of the time when people are trying to model this sort of stuff with whatever climate change and things like that, there are good reasons to discount future people. Some of them are epistemic. We don't know how many of them there are going to be or why. Some of it is just we care less about future people than we care about people in the current era and in the near future. So what do you think the right way of discounting future people is?
The right way of sorry?
Of discounting the preferences of future people.
You mean discounting?
Yeah. So if you look at, say, economic utilitarian modeling, we almost always say that, someone who lives 100 years in the future, their preference is worth, say, half as much as a living person now. And someone who lives 1,000 years in the future, it's worth a tenth as much, or, usually use some sort of logarithmic function to do it. But it doesn't seem like you're doing any discounting at all. So maybe the question is, do you think we should be discounting future people at all? And if so, how should we do it? If not, why not? Because that's a really unusual position.
Well, to be honest, this isn't something I've really thought. I mean, I don't have a clear position about it because I think that we should adapt the calculation to the fact that indeed future generations are, do not exist yet, and so we should. I mean, we should make the calculation more clear, and how I'm gonna do that is not really clear to me right now because I have just started that research. But basically, the idea that came to me was that this is the kind of argument or kind of idea that we find, in environmental ethics, and so this was something I wanted to this was something that I found relevant in that specific topic, because how can I say that? Well, yeah, I should just definitely make that more clear, but I don't have really an idea right now.
Okay, so time for this session to end.